All right, you're going to use this podcast to fill in your notes for the causes of the American Revolution. First, we have to think about the Navigation Acts. This is a review from Chapter 2. These were laws passed by England to prevent any country other than England from profiting from the colonial trade. So anything going in and out of the 13 colonies had to be transported only on British ships, therefore making Great Britain the only one profiting, making them more money, and increasing the idea of mercantilism, the idea that the colonies are there to benefit their mother country. You also have the Proclamation of 1763, which is reviewed from Chapter 5. It was signed by King George III of England, and what it said was any of the 13 colonies living here in the red could not cross over the geographic feature of the Appalachian Mountains into this newly acquired territory that was won from the French and Indian War. And this was used to ease tensions with Native Americans because remember, the Native Americans were living there for hundreds of years before the colonists even arrived in the colonies. We have the Sugar Act of 1764. It was passed by the English Parliament to offset the war debt brought on by the French and Indian War. Remember that the war cost a lot of money. So the English Parliament taxed its subjects, or the colonists in America. They taxed molasses, sugar, coffee, wine, and iron. And this led to smuggling, which meant that the colonists were sneaking goods into the country without paying taxes. And this was obviously an illegal act. So for the Sugar Act, you want to add notes from each one of these bullet points. You have the Stamp Act from 1765. It basically said that all printed materials should be taxed, including newspapers, pamphlets, bills, legal documents, license, almanacs, dice, and playing cards. You can see that those are a lot of commonly used items in the household. So yeah, this started to upset the colonists. The stamp that was put on these showed that the tax was being paid. So literally you couldn't buy playing cards or couldn't buy a newspaper without it being taxed. It may have been a small tax, a 1 or 2 cent tax, but over time that really added up. And at this point, you probably remember this from 4th grade. It becomes the rallying cry for the American Revolution about the idea that the colonists are being taxed without representation in Parliament. So you have the rallying cry, no taxation without representation. Because they were being taxed without representation, you start to see rioting occurring in some major cities. There's huge riots in New York City, as well as tax collectors are being tarred and feathered. Here you have an image where literally they're taking a tax collector and you strip them either down to their underwear or naked, and you pour hot tar over their body. And yes, this was very painful. Afterwards, they would flour them with feathers so that they almost looked like a chicken or something that was not normally seen in the colonies. So it was a form of disgrace for the tax collectors. It was a form of intimidation used by a group known as the Sons of Liberty. These Sons of Liberty were a secret organization that specifically first opposed the Stamp Act and later would oppose many of the other acts or taxes put on the colonists. They used violence and intimidation to protest the Stamp Act, as well as they burned tax collectors in effigy. And what that means is, right here they're showing a hanging body from a tree. This is a tax. It's not an actual tax collector. It's supposed to represent a tax collector in effigy, which means like clothing and straw dummies. Similar to what you would see is almost like a scarecrow. It's supposed to be more symbolic. They didn't actually burn human beings. There was the sister organization to the Sons of Liberty known as the Daughters of Liberty. And what they did was they boycotted British cloth and made their own clothing out of wool, which means when they boycotted, they wouldn't purchase or buy goods made from Great Britain. Instead, they made their own to try and hurt Great Britain's economy that way. In reaction to the Stamp Act, you had a formation from the colonies of the Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York City with representatives from 9 of the colonies. The Congress prepared a petition to be sent to King George III and the English Parliament. This petition was a written document basically saying that they were disagreeing with the Stamp Act. The petition requests the repeal of the Stamp Act of 1764, and eventually, in 1766, it was repealed. So it was a small victory for the colonists, but you'll see soon they just added a different tax in its place. quick checkup. How did the colonists protest the British taxes? Think about those independently. You could have said a number of things. You could have said they boycotted, they smuggled in goods, they intimidated tax collectors by tar and feathering them. The Daughters of Liberty also created their own clothes. So shortly after the Stamp Act is repealed, a British Treasurer, Charles Townshend, proposes a new law for taxes to be collected. Items included imports such as paper, tea, glass, lead, and paints. So again, some really common household goods that were being used pretty frequently that would raise a lot of tax. So because they're frequently used, a lot of colonists then realized that they're again being taken advantage of, and this will just be another one of the acts that will eventually lead to the colonists starting to bear arms and wanting to revolt against Great Britain. In addition to just taxing these common household goods, you had this item called writs of assistance, and this allowed British soldiers to search ships or homes for smuggled goods. Okay, so you definitely want to add the items that are being taxed as well as the writs of assistance. Sitting at your seat, do you think you can think of a common present-day use or an analogy of what the writs of assistance are today that would allow police officers to enter homes? The writs of assistance are very similar to a search warrant that would be issued here today in the United States. When this took place, more British troops were sent to protect the tax collectors that were being tarred and feathered, and colonists despised these troops and sometimes even harassed them. During this time period in the colonies, Sam Adams of Boston organized the Committees of Correspondence to spread information. So in response to the Townshend Acts, they created the Committees of Correspondence, and these were kind of secret groups that were to use information and transport them through the colonies without the British knowing. In doing this, they use propaganda, which means that they're spreading rumors or distorted news in order to make the British look bad. And we'll look at an example for the Boston Massacre later on next week. You have John Hancock, who was a wealthy businessman in Boston that financially supported the revolution. Remember, the revolution itself is going to cost millions of dollars, and we don't really have a government set up that would support all 13 colonies yet. So here you have a major event, the Boston Massacre, that takes place on March 7th, 1770. The information is actually a little bit distorted. So the facts themselves, sometimes you'll see that maybe like 3 people die, 5 people die, 7 people die. What ends up happening is a mob threatens British troops. British troops fire on the Boston mob, killing 5 people, and the other colonies rally around Boston. We'll look at this more in depth later on next week. This is a picture of Paul Revere's engraving of the event, and you can see his engraving, being that he is a colonist, is very one-sided. It shows that the British officers are almost systematically shooting on unarmed civilians, but unfortunately that wasn't necessarily the truth. So here's a picture that is probably a little bit more representative of what probably did happen, in that it was not as well organized. It was very chaotic. Some of the colonists did have weapons, but ultimately at the end they were only colonists who ended up dying. None of the soldiers did from Britain. Crispus Attucks was an African-American man with Native American heritage as well, who was killed at the Boston Massacre, and he became known as the first casualty of the American Revolution, shown here. So you can see already this is the third visual representation of the Boston Massacre that we have, and we'll study all 3 of these later on next week. Same time, you have John Adams, who will eventually become our second president. He is Sam Adams' cousin, and he's a colonist, but he's a Boston lawyer that actually defends the British troops at their trial. Not that he was supporting Great Britain, but he supported the law. 2 soldiers were thumb-branded by the rest, but the rest were acquitted, which meant that they were cleared of their charges. And even this thumb branding was a very minimal charge for killing the colonists. So later, in 1773, before the Boston Tea Party actually happens, you have the Tea Act. In case you want to add these notes, colonists were forced to only buy tea from the British East India Company. Now, because of this, the only country that was really profiting from this, again, it's going to be Great Britain through this company. In response to the Tea Act, the colonists boycott the tea, but then the Sons of Liberty end up kind of putting on a disguise and forming the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Because most colonists drank tea, it was one of the only few imports that was still being taxed. So in response, there were about 50 to 60 Sons of Liberty that dressed as Mohawk Indians and dumped a large supply of tea into the Boston harbor. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament puts into place the Intolerable Acts. And what it basically did, it said four things. First, England wanted to punish the colonists for destroying the tea. The port of Boston was ordered closed. They limited town meetings. And then the Quartering Act was put into place, which said that the colonists must house and feed British troops in time of war. And lastly, the fourth one that's actually not on here, is that any British soldier that was that was charged for a crime, was actually the court case would be held back in England. So we use the analogy from previous years that it's almost like a home court advantage, that any British soldier that was charged with any crime would actually be transported all the way back to England, and their court case would be heard in England. And more times than not, the favor of the ruling was in the side of the British troops. So yeah, again, these four reasons, the British troops being tried in England, the Quartering Act, which meant they had to house British troops, even if they were against the British throne and their government. They limited town meetings, and they closed the port of Boston. Again, are all reasons why the colonists will want to revolt. Eventually, the colonies do unite. The southern colonies eventually send food to the north, specifically Boston, because the port is closed. There's a day of mourning. But more importantly, it leads to the First Continental Congress, and it forms, and it agrees to have an embargo with Britain. And basically what an embargo is it's saying that they're going to ban the trade with a particular country. Obviously, this case, they're going to have an embargo with Britain, so they do not want them to trade with Britain. So the colonies start to trade more with France and the Netherlands and Spain. And so they're trying to hurt their pocketbooks. They're trying to hurt Britain's financial entities, in that they don't want Britain to gain any money from the colonies. The first real skirmish is going to be considered Lexington and Concord. It was 1775. Militia or citizen soldiers formed in each colony. They're known as Minutemen because they could be ready in a minute's notice. The British go to seize Sam Adams, Hancock, and stored arms in Concord, Massachusetts, which is a couple miles outside of Boston. And you hear that fable of Paul Revere and others warn the countryside that the British are coming. We'll actually take an in-depth look at that event later on in the chapter. So at Lexington and Concord, the British soldiers are met by Minutemen at Lexington. It is known as the shot heard around the world. It's the first battle between the colonists. It's a skirmish. It's not a major battle. The first battle we'll learn about in Chapter 7 is the battle at Bunker Hill. But definitely the first time that colonists and these untrained soldiers are fighting the best military power in the world, in the British. The British retreated at Concord after losing more than 70 men. This leads to the Declaration of Independence. When we get to the government unit, we'll spend a couple days actually on the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration itself was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it explained three things. And I shouldn't really say things in social studies. It had three components to the Declaration of Independence. First, it described the natural rights of all citizens, that being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the colonists obviously felt that this was being infringed upon, or it didn't allow them to pursue all three of these with the way that the British Parliament was ruling the colonies. Secondly, it stated the British wrongs, everything that they have done wrong in the past. And then third, it declared independence. Now, a really big misconception is that this did not mean that Great Britain was then free. Let me start over. That did not mean that the colonies were then free. They have to win their independence through the war. This is just a declaration stating that they want their independence, and that's what they're going to fight for. It did not mean that they were then the United States of America. That doesn't happen until after the American Revolution is fought. At the same time, you have read about this guy. His name's Thomas Paine, and in 1776, in January, he writes a pamphlet that basically explains that he didn't think it made sense for England to rule all of America. Because remember, if you think geographically, England is thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean, and they're ruling their colonies that are separated from a vast ocean who have very different ideas and want to break apart. It's the first major pamphlet that colonists read and want to formally start to separate from Britain. So this idea, Common Sense, The Rights of Man, and Other Essential Writings of Thomas Paine becomes very widely read and is one of the biggest reasons why the colonists, or at least it adds fuel to the fire for why the colonists want to revolt. So eventually you have, when things get a little bit more difficult on the colonists from the ports being closed and some of the initial fighting, the colonists actually send an olive branch petition. And what that basically meant was that it was a document written by the colonists to patch things up between Britain and America. They wanted to avoid war. The colonists attempted to settle the dispute peacefully, and when the King of Britain gets this, he basically, King George, is flabbergasted by the idea. They have already killed 70 of their troops at Lexington and Concord, and the king does not accept, almost like their peace treaty. They don't accept it, which basically means the next event that takes place will be both countries, or Great Britain and the colonies, starting to prepare for war. And then lastly, the purpose of government at this point, which the colonists are trying to search for, is first to protect humans' basic rights, to unite, stand up against the British laws and actions, and for delegates from the colonies to meet together to plan the next steps. So those three things: they want to protect the human rights of the colonists, they want the colonies to unite and stand up against British law and actions, and then they need delegates from all the colonies to meet to plan the next steps. And really for this chapter, it ends there. The next point that will take place is going to be the first major battles of the American Revolution.